The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. For 3 decades, our shelves have held treasures signed by amazing giants from the world of literature, brilliant and acclaimed historians, stage and screen superstars, our nation's distinguished leaders, famous sports heroes from many fields, and thousands of other eminent authors. Today on Author Spotlight, our guests are Henry Langrehr and Jim DeFelice discussing their new release, Whatever It Took, an American paratrooper's extraordinary memoir of escape, survival, and heroism in the last days of World War II. And now, here is our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome to Author Spotlight. Today we're going to meet Henry Langrehr, the recipient of 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and the French Legion of Honor. Henry is at his home in Clinton, Iowa. Also, we'll meet Jim DeFelice. Jim DeFelice is the co-author of this book and several other outstanding books like Every Man a Hero. It's another powerful World War II story. West Like Lightning, The Real History of the Pony Express, and Codename Johnny Walker, the story of a brave Iraqi who fought with our Navy SEALs. Henry Langrehr, thank you for your service and thank you for being with us today. If you will, let's go back to Tuesday morning, about 2 o'clock, on June the 6th, 1944. You are aboard a C-47 transport with fellow members of the 82nd Airborne. As you approach the drop zone, you run into a ton of ack-ack fire and boom, all of a sudden your plane is hit. Would you tell us what's going on inside that aircraft?
Well, there was one fellow on right kind of next to me, and then another man across the aisle that was hit with shrapnel that went through the plane, and they slumped over, so we assumed they were dead.
Henry, you are the first man out. Will you tell us why you are the first man out?
I was a demolition expert, and I had a demolition bag extended on a 10-foot line that I was going to go out with me. It was tied to my ankle. Stupid me, because if it had been any more weight, it probably would have pulled my leg off. But I was the first man out because of the fact I had the demolition bag.
As you leave the plane, would you describe for our viewers just exactly the images you saw immediately upon leaving the aircraft?
Well, it was a missed drop where we were at, and it so happened it was St. Mary Eglise. And when I left the plane and right it in my parachute, I could see all the fire that was going on in the one building that was burning, and I could see the people in the churchyard. I could see the German soldiers down there. Pretty clear. The moon was pretty clear that night, and so all in all, it was pretty much chaos down there.
Henry, you made a stop before you hit the ground. Will you share just what that stop was?
As I went down, we jumped about 800 feet, and as I was coming down, everything is kind of on the ground is just kind of black, like you guys can't make anything out until you're almost on top of it. Well, anyway, I hit this greenhouse, big greenhouse, but as I was lucky because my leg pack went through that glass dome first, And then I went through. I got scraped up a little bit, but nothing compared to what would have happened if I'd have gone through the glass. So, and then when I got down there, I hit on a table. There was a table in the middle of the room there, and I took off my lanyard that I had with explosives, and I figured I could always come back and get them because I could hear the fighting and shooting over in the churchyard. So I took off the lanyard and got out. There's a door right there on the right side or left side when I came in. And I went out that door, and there was a wall before the street there, about 3 foot high or so. I went over that into the street and then over into the churchyard, and there was fighting going on, of course. And I seen John Steele hanging up in the steeple, and John looked like John was dead. I didn't know, but I did see some of the other troopers that was hanging in the trees and that. They were all had been shot before they got a chance to get down on the ground.
When you hit the ground, you joined your fellow airborne guys and started fighting to meet up with the troops on the beach. Will you tell us about a couple of things? Tell us about fighting in the hedgerows and about the flooding the Germans had done to prepare for your landing.
The landscapes, they were kind of bad, but in a way, the Germans kind of fooled themselves because the roads were the only way to get down to the beach. The land was flooded on both sides of the roads. So to hold the bridges and the town was very, very important because all those roads led down to beach. And had they have got past us, the invasion certainly wouldn't have been successful. And the hedgerow fighting was almost like jungle fighting because the hedgerows, if you've seen pictures of it, they raised up about anywhere from 8 feet to 10 feet high with a lot of scrub and trees growing out of them for perfect defense areas. And the Germans had been there a long time, and they knew and had been on maneuvers in there, anti-airborne maneuvers, just before we got there. So they had everything staked out pretty well. And whenever we was to go through a hedgerow or anything, they knew they could drop a mortar rocket or any type of thing. They had everything set up, booby traps, they had 88s, they had tanks. It was pretty rough going through the hedgerows. It was more or less like almost jungle warfare, you might say.
Jim, will you chime in and share some of the details of the fighting that Henry is too modest to talk about?
One of the things that's interesting is that you have to remember the 82nd. Now, the 82nd Airborne, by this point in the war, was always an elite unit, but it's also, they've been in some of the roughest battles of the war to this point, whether it was in Sicily or Italy, and they've jumped before. And Henry's a new guy. This is his first exposure to combat. So he, and he's placed with a unit kind of at the last minute where he's really, he's the new guy. He's the young guy. He's, no offense, but he's the expendable guy. And I think that, it's hard now for us to remember or to even imagine. When we see a movie, it looks very organized. War is not very organized at all, and it certainly wasn't organized that night. It was very ad hoc. I don't want to give away the entire story of the book, but as you see Henry's story, I think confusion maybe was the order of the day in a sense. But these soldiers, each member of the 82nd and the 101st for that matter, all of the paratroopers, they were trained to work individually as well as teams. And, they were able to improvise not only on that night when it was extremely important, and they would meet up. But also as the as the war goes on, and not only in Normandy, we see them. Airborne troops play a very important role at the Battle of the Bulge later on, and in other fights. It's just amazing to me the amount of initiative that these guys showed and the bravery, whether they were a single guy or when they were coherent units. And maybe Henry has some insight into why how these fellows were able to to work on their own, and then maybe join up in 2s and 3s and eventually 10s and 20s. Why was there so much personal initiative, Henry?
Well, we were trained that way, whether it was in individual or as in a group. But as a mixed group, we also went very well. Everyone knew what a mission was. And the few guys that were there that knew the mission, we followed them. Whether it was a sergeant or it was a lieutenant, no matter who it was, we know we could trust them, and we know that they'd guard our back. So we were very cohesive, even as a broken group, even as a scattered force. We could still band together and do our job, which we did.
Henry, for the next couple of weeks, you experienced all the horrors of war. You've got hand-to-hand combat, you're dodging mines. Take us to a Thursday afternoon, about 3 o'clock, June 29th, 1944. You and your buddies have just pushed the Germans out of a field, and they counterattack. And all of a sudden, you find yourself staring at a massive gun on the turret of a Tiger tank. You write in the book that you don't think that gun is going to fire at you, but it does. Tell us what you remember right after that bam from that gun.
Well, all I could remember is that the tank fired, and it must have been shooting at something behind me, because it didn't hit me. It landed behind me, but the shrapnel, I was wounded in the back and in the legs. So I didn't know anything until I was picked up, and I was in a field hospital with a German sergeant who spoke perfect English.
So you're now a prisoner of war. You spent about a year as a slave laborer in a coal mine. And you and your friend Tim decide the thing to do is to attempt an escape. You know it's sure death if you're caught, but this is the decision you make. You wait until there are very few guards. I think you said there are 4 guards, and you jumped into the bushes and start running. As you approach a town, really just an hour or so later, you're spotted, and you and Tim run in a barn. Will you take it from there, Henry, and tell us what happened inside that barn?
There was no shelter inside the barn when we went in. It was completely empty. Tim was in the middle of the barn, and for some unknown reason, I stepped behind the door, and behind the door was a 2x4 that they used to lock the doors from inside. I grabbed the 2x4, but the moment I can't think of what they call them now, but anyway, when the police entered, he immediately shot my friend and killed him. Shot him in the head. And after that, I grabbed the 2x4 as he shot him and hit him right fully across the face with the 2x4. Then I took his ammunition belt and took off, and his gun. And after that, it was like the book says, whatever it took.
During the next couple of weeks, as you're doing whatever it took, you reinforce that title over and over again. You finally are nearing American troops. Will you share what all went on as you approached that area and just what you saw and heard, and really what you felt?
First of all, before I met the American troops, I was in a wooded area, in a big scrub area, where I could watch the road. I was probably maybe 150, 200 yards away. And first thing you know, I could hear artillery, and I knew when you get used to artillery, you know who's theirs and who's ours. And I could hear the artillery, and I knew it was American artillery. So I thought, well, I'll just sit here tight and see what happens. Well, pretty soon I saw a bunch of civilians, wagons and carts and that coming down the road. And I thought, well, pretty soon then come the German infantry, and then came half tracks, mobile artillery, all that kind of stuff. And pretty soon I saw a little Piper Cub up there, a spotter plane, and they was looking over that group down there, and they must have called in the coordinates, and pretty soon shells started dropping on that group and just tore that whole group all to pieces. It was terrible. And after that was all done, I still had waited, and pretty soon I saw American infantry scouts coming down. And after the scouts came in through and everything was cleared off, then the basic infantry came down, and pretty soon the heavier equipment, the artillery and the tanks and that came down. And I wasn't about to move because I didn't want to get shot. Anyhow, as they all passed, and after that I got out and I went down, and there was a radio man in a Jeep. In those days, the radios weren't like our headphones are now. You know, you can hold it in your hand and see the world. Back then, it was a cumbersome machine, and he was on the phone talking. He had his back towards me, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and oh boy,
Oh,
he cussed me out a little bit for scaring him to death. So then they he took me down to headquarters, and down there they debriefed me, which of course I didn't know after prisoner of war. I didn't know anything. And they put me on a plane, and C-47 with a couple of wounded guys, and sent me to another place where they took another plane and then put me took me to Camp Lucky Strike in France.
We are overwhelmed at the condensed version of your sharing what's in this amazing book. It's not just a war story, but a big bonus is finding out what's going on in civilian life at the home front, before, during, and after the war. You share that you had a whole bunch of jobs. You worked on a farm, you were an usher at a movie theater, you worked at a toy factory, but your most important job, in all due respect to your help in freeing the world, was at a fly swatter factory. Henry, will you share why that turned out to be the most important job of your life?
That job, my wife at that time, she worked a sewing machine that sewed the edging around the fly swatter. And I made holes in handles and put the handles on the fly swatters. So I was a little bit shy. I thought she looked pretty nice. And I thought, well, I'd like to date her, but I don't think she'd want to date me. So I never said anything. Well, a friend of mine that worked with us there, he called her up and asked her if she would mind if I dated her. I didn't ask her myself. So he, when he said that, I did ask her, and she said, "Oh yeah, she would go out with me." So that was the beginning of a courtship that's lasted almost, well, July 1st, be 75 years. We'd be married.
In the book, we read there's quite a difference in what was going on in the home front at war in the 40s as opposed to Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. There was rationing on everything from sugar to shoes, and so many of those in civilian life were working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week to help produce weapons for the guys overseas. Henry, share with us what Arlene's job was.
Arlene worked 12-hour shifts at a college company making machine gun stands. She took and reamed out the pipes, and I think she threaded them too. But she worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. And I think the pay, if I'm not mistaken, she said one time was 75 cents an hour. They stabilized the wage situation, you know, you couldn't get a raise. But it was a group effort. Our people came together so well. After I always said that God had his hands on us. He gave us the depression so we could overcome these things that were going to come afterwards. I think that Arlene saved her money while she worked, and I saved my pay and that. And when we got back home, we built our first home, and no mortgage, no nothing. So, but you know, I'm amazed at the amount of material that our people gave us. Like I said, you know, earlier, when I was going to France, I could look down and I could see ships. I honestly could see ships. I thought I could walk to France on ships. Then I could look overhead, and there was immense Air Force. Our planes were the first ones down below. Then the next ones were the bombers, and then the next ones were the fighters, and it was tremendous. And I thought, my goodness, they gave us all of this. We just can't lose. But we did come very close to losing.
Jim, as we said, this book is not just a war story. The appendix that you added gives us a great view of really the history of the world during this time. Would you share with our viewers what you talked about in the postscript in this incredible book?
Actually, I met Henry. I was the first Army, which during the war was the unit, the organization basically that ran the invasion of Normandy. First Army had a celebration, I guess celebration or commemoration is a better word, commemorating D-Day that was broadcast throughout the world to Army units. Henry was, they had brought Henry in as the guest of honor, and they invited me as well. And I think that what they were trying to do is, from the moment I landed and started talking, everyone from I think it was a sergeant who drove me to the commanding general, were talking about Henry and his amazing story. It was very interesting as we were on the satellite link to all of the bases, and I could see the reactions of even the just whether it was enlisted, the officers, these guys, many of these men and women had already been in combat, and yet they were amazed, to hear the story, to hear the links, not only with Henry, but also, through Henry to their history, to what other people had done. And it was just the valor that they have today is very much linked to the valor that not only Henry but other people, everyone in the war, really. And we were trying to, in doing the book, we wanted to give an impression that this is not the story of one man or one marriage. And Arlene is extremely important for Henry, and his, kind of getting through it. She prayed for him every day, and she just knew, she had this optimism that he was going to survive, even when there was no news at first. But we wanted to show how the country, the entire country, was, participated in the war, and to a large extent, the things that not only Arlene, but the people, the women who worked beside her in that factory in Iowa and throughout the United States, they too played an important role in the war and in defeating Nazism and restoring freedom and democracy in France and freedom to the world, and stopping some of the evils that we talked about. The other aspect of the book that was important to us was to talk about the reality of war. And when we said, whatever had to be done, a lot of what has to happen in wars, unfortunately, is very brutal. And we didn't want to close our eyes to that. And, that's why we try to stay out of wars. We fight them hard when we have to. But, if we can, peace generally is a better way. And, one of the things that's interesting, it always interested me is, Henry, after the war goes on to, he and his wife build a house, and then they start building other things. And Henry has a very successful company. And one of the things that he's most proud of, at least listening to him, are the schools. They're working for the school districts and helping people and helping children and educate them. And I don't think that's an accident. One aspect of the book that we haven't mentioned that surprised me, I've always heard that there's, no atheists in foxholes. Well, Henry claims to have been an atheist during the war, and even says that there were other fellows who really didn't believe in God. And I can kind of understand that. You see all of this horrible, horrible stuff, and, and you start to lose your faith. And after the war, when he comes home and he talks to Arlene, and who becomes his wife, he changes and has a moment of faith. And maybe he could probably talk about that a little bit better in a little more detail. But yeah, that's a remarkable thing for me.
Yeah, that's very true, Jim. My wife brought me to Christ, and I said I was a heathen. My folks never had a Bible in their house. We never went to church. My dad was Lutheran and my mom was Catholic, so consequently, we just didn't know anything about the Lord. And all through the service, and I had incidences where friends died, and I picked one up, and he was dying. He had been saying the Lord's Prayer. And another one, was the same way. He'd been hit by shrapnel from a mortar, and he was saying the 23rd Psalm. When those men died, they had a different look on their face, a kind of a smile. And I always thought to myself, could I die like that? And at the time, I didn't think I could, because all I knew about was killing. And when I got home, and after having escaped from the prison and coming home, and my wife telling me that she'd been praying for me all the time, and she's just lovingly brought me to the Lord, and I've been so happy. In fact, I wouldn't say this to anybody else, but I'd say it to Jim. That half of the money that comes from any of the books goes to charity, and we just feel that that is the right thing to do.
Thank you, Jim. And Henry, thank you for your service, and thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing what's in your marvelous, wonderful, great